Have you ever been scrolling through social media and seen a clip of a politician talking about some government spending bill that costs billions of dollars? Maybe you saw comments from people furious about how the country is drowning in debt. But what if I told you that nearly every country on Earth has debt? From India to Germany to Switzerland to Qatar, even big rich nations are no exception. The US alone is over $36 trillion in the red, and Japan's debt is more than double its entire economy. So why do countries have debt? Why not just print more money? Is national debt always a bad thing? And if countries owe money, who are they borrowing from? In this video, we'll answer all these questions and more. Let's get started. What is national debt? When we talk about a country's debt, we're referring to its national debt, also known as public debt, government debt, or sovereign debt. This is the total amount of money a nation's federal or central government owes. Just like a person takes out a loan to buy a car or a house, governments borrow money when their expenses exceed their income. The key thing to remember is that national debt refers only to the debt of the central government. For example, the US national debt doesn't include the debt of individual states like California or Texas, nor does it include the personal debt of citizens, such as credit card debt or mortgages. States can have their own debt, and so can individuals, but those aren't part of the national debt. So now you know what national debt is. But why do countries take on debt in the first place? Why do countries borrow money? You might be thinking, why do governments borrow money when they could just print more? That's a great question, and the answer is simple. Printing unlimited money leads to disaster. If a government mindlessly prints money, it floods the economy with cash, which leads to hyperinflation. Prices for everyday goods skyrocket, and the currency becomes almost worthless. Investors lose faith and the economy collapses. This has happened in countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Borrowing, however, comes with interest, which forces governments to be more responsible and disciplined with their spending. So, with that in mind, here are 5 main reasons why countries borrow money. 1. Covering budget deficits. A government's main source of income is taxes. However, it's common for a country's expenses to exceed its tax revenue, which is known as a budget deficit. For instance, a government might collect $3 trillion in taxes, but need $4 trillion to fund things like education, healthcare, and public services. That's a $1 trillion shortfall. To cover this gap, the government has a few options. They could cut spending, but that would mean fewer services, worse schools, and underfunded hospitals, which would likely lead to public outrage. They could also raise taxes, but that would make life harder for everyone and also risk protests. The most common solution is to borrow money to cover the deficit. 2. Investing in growth. Borrowing isn't always a sign of a problem. It can be an investment in the future. Imagine a country that needs new roads, schools, and hospitals but doesn't have the cash. Instead of waiting years to save up, the government can borrow money and build these essential things now. These investments improve people's lives and boost the economy faster. Stronger economy means more tax revenue, which in turn makes it easier for the country to pay off its debt later. 3. Handling crises and emergencies. Sometimes borrowing is a necessity. When unexpected events like wars, natural disasters, or pandemics hit, governments need to act fast. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, the US borrowed over $3.8 trillion to provide stimulus checks and aid to businesses. Without that borrowing, the economic fallout could have been much worse, and countless more people would have lost their jobs. 4. Refinancing old debt. Just like people take out new loans to pay off old ones, governments do the same thing on a massive scale. Let's say a country borrowed money in 2010 with a repayment date of 2020. When 2020 arrives, if it can't afford to pay back the loan, it will likely take out a new loan to cover the old one. This cycle is sustainable as long as the country can manage its debt. But if it loses control, it can spiral into a crisis, as we saw in Sri Lanka, which defaulted on its debt in 2022, leading to widespread chaos. 5. Controlling the economy. Governments also use borrowing as a financial tool to control interest rates and inflation. By issuing bonds, they can pull money out of the economy, which helps lower inflation. Conversely, they can borrow more to inject money into the economy and stimulate growth when things are slow. Now that we know why countries borrow money, the next question is, who is lending them all that money? Governments borrow billions, even trillions of dollars, so you might wonder which single bank has that much money. The truth is, governments don't borrow from just one source. They get loans from 3 main places: domestic lenders, foreign lenders, and their own central bank. Let's break it down. 1. Domestic lenders. You might not know this, but you can lend money to your own country. When a government needs to borrow, it issues things like bonds and treasuries. When you buy a bond, you're essentially lending the government money, and they promise to pay you back with interest. Domestic lenders include not only individual citizens, but also local commercial banks, companies, and even other government agencies. For example, in the US, the Social Security Administration can buy government bonds to earn interest on its extra funds, which is called intragovernmental debt. In fact, in March 2025, intragovernmental debt made up about 20% of the US national debt. 2. Foreign lenders countries also borrow from foreign sources. Just like domestic citizens and banks, foreign citizens and banks can buy a country's bonds. Foreign governments also buy each other's bonds, often as a way to invest their money in stable economies. For instance, countries like Japan and China are some of the largest holders of U.S. Treasury bonds. However, if a country's economy isn't stable, foreign investors might be hesitant to buy its bonds because they don't trust that they'll get their money back. In these cases, countries might seek direct loans from organizations like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, IMF. The World Bank offers low-interest loans for things like infrastructure projects. The IMF, on the other hand, provides emergency loans to prevent financial collapse. But these loans come with very strict conditions, such as requiring the country to raise taxes and cut spending, which can sometimes lead to further economic hardship and public unrest. 3. Its own central bank. In theory, a government can borrow directly from its own central bank, a process known as debt monetization. The central bank can print new money and use it to buy government bonds. However, most countries avoid doing this because it can lead to hyperinflation and devalue the currency. Instead, central banks often buy bonds indirectly from commercial banks to control inflation and interest rates. Is national debt a bad thing? Debt is often seen as a bad thing, but for a country, it's a double-edged sword. It's beneficial as long as it's used and managed responsibly. As we've seen, borrowing can boost the economy by funding infrastructure and helping a country navigate a crisis. However, too much debt can be dangerous. A country that keeps borrowing just to pay off old debt can fall into a debt trap. When debt becomes too large, a country has to spend more and more on interest payments, taking money away from essential services like healthcare and education. This can cause investors to lose confidence in the country's ability to pay back its loans, which can lead to a lower credit rating. Just like you have a credit score, countries have credit ratings. A bad rating makes it harder to borrow, forcing a country to offer higher interest rates, which can lead to a debt crisis and even a default, where the country simply gives up on paying its debt. So how much debt is too much? There's no exact number, but one common measure is the debt-to-GDP ratio, which compares a country's total debt to the size of its economy. Many economists consider a ratio of 60% or lower to be a safe level. Some countries, like the US, have a legal limit on how much they can borrow, called a debt ceiling, but this is often just raised to avoid a default. Can a country be debt-free? Technically, yes, a country could be debt-free, but in reality, almost no country is, and for most, it's not even a good idea. Every country in the world has some level of debt. The closest example of a debt-free entity is Macau, but it's not a sovereign country. It's a special administrative region of China. Macau can afford to be debt-free because it's tiny, with a huge income from its casinos. Even if a country could eliminate its debt, it probably wouldn't. Being debt-free would require massive spending cuts or huge tax hikes, both of which would likely slow down the economy and cause public protest. Without government debt, there would also be no government bonds, which are a critical low-risk investment for things like pension funds. Without bonds, retirement funds would have to invest in riskier assets, making the financial markets more volatile and retirements less secure. In the end, debt is not inherently good or bad. It's all about how it's managed. Next time you hear someone talking about a country's debt, you'll know that it's not about whether a country has debt, but about whether it's using that debt wisely. I hope this video helped you better understand national debt.